Okay, Swamiji, welcome to our space here.
Thank you.
When I originally found the place and then later came here with my sister, we gave it the name Northern Lights. So we will just continue with that name. So welcome to Northern Lights.
Thank you.
And I'm very happy you're here and giving the very first lecture on the 8th of April in Afife.
So, what I usually talk about is something called the Vedas. If you look at Buddhism, Hinduism, even some of the other Asian traditions, they mostly are derived from something called the Veda, V-E-D-A. Veda is a body of knowledge. It's not a book like the Bible. It's not like the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita. It's a body of knowledge that was compiled by ancient sages, and this was transmitted, compiled and transmitted orally. So there are two things. One is that the compilation was done through an oral form because we didn't have paper in those days. Paper, ink was something that was incredibly scarce and not available. There wasn't an industry that produced paper in those days. So there was some effort done in actually recording something in palm leaves, but that was not very effective either. Also, when you talk about the Western culture, it's something that is, it's used to something written. It's a literal culture. In Asian cultures, they are not literal culture. If you look at the Aborigines, the Native Americans, they don't have something written down. So how does the wisdom get transmitted from one generation to the other? And it's done through stories, and it's done through elders transmitting and teaching their kids that wisdom. So the question is, when you transmit one wisdom to another generation, it tends to get corrupted. It tends to get modified, sometimes even misheard. Because it's like when you hear a story and then you tell the story to somebody else, there is a lot that gets lost. So if I tell you a rumor at this end, by the time it gets back to me, the rumor is completely different. Okay, so that's exactly what happened also in the transmission process. So what the ancient Indian civilization did is that in order for that corruption to not take place, they had an ingenious way of preserving the knowledge. And what they did is they would take this entire wisdom and convert it into a few words. So they would create formulas. These formula words would then be stored or designed in a way that would be easy to remember. So they would be in a form of prose, or they would be in a form of essays, songs, or poems. So these poems were then compiled and written by older sages. No, I wouldn't say written, but used verbally. So once these poems are composed, then you would remember them. It's like songs. When you learn to practice a song, or when you hear a song, that song would be easy to memorize, and you would learn to recite it. So these prose or these poems were written by these ancient sages, or compiled by these ancient sages, so that we could remember them. So the first part of preserving this wisdom is to learn to memorize. In fact, the Mayans had a very good way of saying something. They had a brilliant saying which said that you write something down in order to forget. So it's a very powerful statement when you hear it. But because we're in the Western society now, we have to write it down. But it does say something that when you write down, that means you make less effort to remember. So you had this tradition in the ancient time where they would preserve this knowledge by teaching young children, because their minds would be like sponges, to memorize, to recite. So you find this body of knowledge was all compiled and it was actually chanted. So you chanted the verses which would compile the poems. And then later on, as you get older, then those poems would then be unfolded. Like for instance, many of you are familiar with William Shakespeare. If you read his poems, they didn't make sense as a child, but as you get older, they have profound meaning. And that's exactly what happened with the Vedas. So the Vedas were a body of knowledge. First, it was actually compiled and transmitted in an ingenious way so that nobody would corrupt it. And till today, the same tradition continues. We're talking about a tradition that started beyond 15,000 years. We know that they were there in 15,000 years ago. But what they chanted 15,000 years ago is something that we study today. We chant today exactly the same way that was chanted 15,000 years ago. So that's one thing. The second thing is that this body of knowledge was received, okay? So it was not created by a human mind, which is very important, because when we say something was created by a human mind, as we know, is limited. Our minds are limited. We can only see certain things, we can feel certain things, we can hear certain things. In fact, dogs and cats and animals have a better hearing than we do. Some animals or birds have better sight than we do. So when you look at it, when we look at our five senses, our five sense organs, on how we perceive information, it's incredibly limited. Okay, so just given that fact. But then, you know, for instance, when we look, we use our sense organs to see how the sun, we see the sun rise, and we see the sun set. We see the sun move from the eastern horizon to the western horizon. And so we can be convinced, because everybody will agree with me, that it is the sun that rises and sets. It's the sun that rotates, and not the earth, because I don't see the earth rotating. I don't see the earth moving. I see the sun rise and sunset. So when Galileo came out and said, well, it's not true that the earth, it is the earth that rotates and not the sun, you know, the Vatican and everyone else thought he was crazy. Okay. So if you look at it from a scientific point of view, we can say that, look, the sun rises and the sun sets. I take a democratic vote, because democracy is very important also. And everybody in my village and everyone in my country will say the sun rises and sun sets. So when Galileo says that's not true, he must be crazy, because everybody else is correct and he is wrong. Then you have three references in the Bible that says exactly that the earth is stationary and the sun rotates around the earth. Actually four references in the Bible that does that. So not only you have my own evidence, you have the evidence of your society and community. Your whole lifestyle revolves around the fact that the sun rises and sun sets. And then, on top of it, you have a religious document that says the sun rises and sun sets. So how does that one guy called Galileo comes out and says that's not true? Okay. How does he know that? So what is interesting is that today, after so many 500 years, let's say, that we know that it is the earth that rotates around the sun. We know that because of NASA's and other modern scientific equipment and spaceships and satellites and things like that, that it is the sun that rotates. And Galileo was in fact right. How is it that 6,000, 10,000, 15,000 years ago, there was a group of people who were able to know this, what Galileo found out or what we know today? They knew not only that the earth rotated around the sun, they also knew that the distances of the planets. They knew the size of the planets. They knew the speed of the planets. How did they know that without telescopes, without computers that we have today? Where did they get this information? Not only in terms of stars and planets and the galaxies, they also knew about the human body. They know more about the human body then than we do today. Yeah. There is a body of knowledge called Ayurveda, which gives you this three dynamic, biodynamic energies in our body that is evident. You look at a person, you know what's going on. I had it when I was studying with my teacher in India. I was studying Ayurveda, and I had like a good intern. I had my note, and we had our white coats, and I was sitting with my teacher here, and we had a glass door, and the next patient, you could see the next patient outside. And my teacher was saying, you see that next patient who's out there? He has this symptoms, and he gave me a whole list of symptoms that he came to. He has this problem, health problem. He told me everything before the patient actually came in. I took down those notes. The patient comes in. What the doctor then does is asks him, what are his symptoms? And it was interesting. The patient listed those symptoms exactly the way the doctor had told me, in sequence. But the doctor doesn't tell him what he has. The doctor already knew. He was just asking and touching and doing the test, like the pulse check and doing the pulse check of the wrist, and then asking him more questions as if he didn't know anything. Finally, the doctor prescribes some recommendations according to Ayurveda, and then the patient leaves. As soon as the patient leaves, I asked the doctor, why didn't you just tell him? It would be so impressive. You walk the door and the doctor just tells you what's wrong with you, and you just do. So I found that whole period of about 15 minutes a waste of time. He says, no. Part of healing is listening to the patient. They have to be validated. They have to be heard. And it was a very powerful learning for me, that listening to a patient is very important. But the reason why I'm telling you the story is because this person, the doctor, according to Ayurveda, could actually see the diseases, see what was wrong with this patient, even without touching him. Today, when you go to Western allopathic medicine, as soon as you see the doctor doesn't tell you much. They prescribe a gazillion tests. You have to go and do this hundreds of tests and come back 2 weeks later. You might be dead by that time. Come back 2 weeks later, and then they'll tell you, oh yeah, you had this and this and that, and then they will give you something off the book. Yeah. In Ayurveda, they can talk about your energies, which is evident. You can see it in a person. You can see where they are, how they are going. This is without a stethoscope. How is it? And if you dissect this person, if you dissect a human being, you're not going to find them. You're not going to find these energies. They say a human being has 7 chakras. How do you know that? If you dissect, cut up a person, you're not going to see these 7 chakras. Ayurveda says we have 70,000 channels in our body. You don't see those channels. How is it that we know that? How is it that these people knew all these things without computers, without the knowledge that we have today? And we're talking about this body of knowledge that existed 15,000 years ago or more. Some say 3,000, some say 6,000, but basically there was a guy who did a study on this, and he was able to go back to 15,000 years ago. The point I'm trying to make here is that this body of knowledge was received. Human mind cannot, with its 5 senses, comprehend all this information or even receive it, even come up with it. You cannot make this thing up. So Veda is a body of knowledge, and that's what we call it. It's a body of knowledge that was received. The question is, how was it received? So we can say that this information was received by the sages, that these people were trained to hear through other means, in a scientific way, in a very concrete way, that this information came to them. So we can say angels or other beings or terrestrial beings actually provided this information to these sages, to these rishis, as we call them in India. And these rishis then compile the information in a prose, in a formula that can be remembered and then transmitted till we get it today. Based on my own studies and my own education and my own experience, I have come to find out that all of this information, to the extent that we can prove to be true, is true. I have yet to find anything that is not true in the Vedas. In fact, if the information is seen as contradictory, the only reason it is contradictory is because it is not understood properly, one, or it is understood in a different context. But it may appear to be contradictory when in fact it isn't. So, to the extent that we can prove whether the information is true or not, that information I find, in fact all of the information I find in the Vedas is true. Now this body of knowledge, which we call the Veda, is actually divided into two portions. So the first portion, which we consider the 90% of it, is what we call the karma kanda side of things. Karma, kanda. Kanda means belt or section. Karma is what you know is an action. So the first portion, which is 90% of the Vedas, is doing. Karma in Sanskrit simply means doing, an act. It doesn't mean that when you do something, it's the stuff that comes back to you. That's not what it means as we know it in the West. Karma simply means doing. Like I'm speaking. So the very fact that I'm speaking right now is I'm doing an act of speaking. I'm doing a karma of speaking. Okay. If you take the literal word of karma in Sanskrit and translate it to English, it's to do, to act. So if you're walking, you're doing an action of walking. You're doing a karma of walking. So that's what karma means. So why do we have 90% of a section of a body of knowledge that tells us what to do? The 90% of the Vedas tells us what to do because we as human beings have desires. We want many things. And because we want many things, there is a prescription, a description of how to attain these things in a dharmic way, in a way that is correct, in a way that is not harming to anyone. Okay? So there is a prescription, there are rituals. When I say prescription, these are broken down into rituals. And these rituals are for people to want to fulfill their desires. For instance, you want to get married. There's a ritual when you get married. You want to have a son. There's a ritual. You want a beautiful, fair, in India there's a very beautiful girl based on certain features. There's a ritual for that. You want a tall, dark, handsome person. There's a ritual for that. So you want to be wealthy. There's a ritual for that. You want to be a king or a queen. There's a ritual for that. So all these rituals are there for to fulfill human desires. Because if we cannot fulfill human desires, they will not come to what is more important. What is more important is in the last 10%, the last section of the Vedas. And in that last section of the Vedas, what it tells us is that the entire universe, the galaxies, the planets, the animals, the snakes, the mosquitoes, everything that we know and everything that we see and everything that we don't know and we can't see, everything is nothing but one. There's only one existence in different forms. Now it may seem a little philosophical, but it isn't. It is an understanding. So you see, the first portion of the Vedas is about doing rituals to fulfill our needs. The last portion of the Vedas tells us that everything that we see in the universe is nothing but one. So the last 10% of the Vedas teaches us that the world is one. It is a teaching of oneness. Because what makes it difficult is that you are there, I am here. You are listening to me speak. Because you are there and I'm here, how can you and I be the same? How is it that I can be the same with my arch enemy? How can I be one with the person who kidnaps my child? How can I be one with the person who kills my child? How can I be one with Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or Hitler? So when we look at all our lives and at different situations, everything that we know and everything that we experience is duality, is not me. So then why does a body of knowledge tells us that we are one? Okay. So the greatest teaching, and we consider it to be the most sacred, and in fact the most valuable endeavor in the world, is to recognize that we're one, is to understand that we're one. And this is where the difference in the Vedas takes place, because in the first portion, the 90%, is that we have to do something. In the latter portion, or the final portion, we have to understand. And that's essentially how the Vedas are broken down into. Now, by understanding that we're one, it actually gives us tremendous benefits. We as human beings, we are constantly searching for something. Once we fulfill our desires, we find an emptiness. And because we find an emptiness, we are looking for something else. What we are looking for is to recognize that we are one. We are looking for ourselves. We are looking to understand who we are. We get to understand who we are by understanding, not by doing. There's a big difference. Okay. By understanding who we are, we find who we are. A sugar crystal does not discover its sweet. A sugar crystal goes out to search spirituality. A sugar crystal may be out there looking for sweetness. What the teaching says, that you are sweet. It tells the sugar crystal, you are sweet, you just have to know. There's nothing to do in that case. You just have to know. Likewise, this teaching tells us that we are all one, and we have to know this beyond a shadow of doubt. It's not a belief. It is not something that you sit back and say, oh well, it is true that I have to believe this, and you have to do rituals to believe it. It's not that way. You have to know it. You have to understand it. It's not that your teacher knows or your teacher has to understand it. You have to understand it, and that's the big difference. If the teacher knows it, great. Then the teacher can teach you because the teacher knows it. If the teacher doesn't know that we are one, then how can the teacher teach? So the objective of the latter portion, or the last 10% of the Vedas, is to help us teach and understand that we are all one, beyond a shadow of doubt. Beyond any doubt. And you don't have to be in an altered state, you don't have to be in a meditative state, you don't have to be in any different state. Wherever you are, right now, the way you are is when you understand you're one. With complete understanding. And so you find that these ancient beings were able to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that we are one. And that teaching of oneness is what we call Vedanta. Why is it called Vedanta? Because it's at the end of the Vedas. So Veda is the body of knowledge. Anta in Sanskrit means end of the knowledge, end of the body of knowledge. It separates what is to be done versus what is to be understood. That's a huge difference right there. So the end portion is to be understood. How do you understand once you fulfill your desires and realize that everything that you pursue in life, all your desires, every desire, really ends into an emptiness. Knowing that you're one, knowing the oneness, is the only thing that fulfills, gives us a fulfillment that we are looking for. And so it is in the end. So the positional end is very profound. Now, the way I also describe this is, for instance, in the English literature, what we do is when we read something, we have an introduction, then we have a body of knowledge, and then we have a conclusion. This is how we read anything. But let's say when you go to a cafe with your friend and you're having a conversation, you don't start your conversation with your friend and say, look, I'm going to tell you something, but please let me finish. You know, I'll do an introduction, I'll tell you the body, and I give you a conclusion, and then you respond. Is that okay? I mean, you don't have conversations like this, right? So when you're talking, what happens is that you start with something, I give you a basic information, you respond. So it's a conversation when you are in a cafe. Because it's an oral tradition, if I'm going to teach you something orally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you the basics, and then I'm going to build up on it. So there's this building blocks. Just like in construction, you have the foundation, you build the foundation, and after that you start building one brick at a time, one brick by brick, and you start building the house. The same way, this whole body of knowledge is designed that way. And in fact, it really tells you from the beginning to the end, whether it's the beginning or whether it's the end. For instance, you might have heard of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. If you have studied that or if you have done some yoga, you see that the first words start with Atta. Ataha means now. When it says now, that means there's something preceding it. Okay? So whenever you look at the Indian text, it is designed in that way because it's an oral tradition. So what is more important in an oral tradition is the final, the end. So in a conversation, if I'm teaching you something, I would say something, and I'll give you the basic foundation. Then I build up on it, then I build up on it, and I build up on it. And then in the end, I bring it all together to conclude it. And this is exactly how the Vedas is designed. There is the beginning, there's a build-up to the end. In English or Western tradition, we have the body, we have the introduction, we have the main body, and then we have the conclusion. The conclusion doesn't explain it, it just summarizes what was explained earlier. In the Indian body of knowledge, it doesn't work that way because it was based on a tradition, or it was based on the oral tradition. So you take something, you build up on it, in the end you tell what is more important. And so again, Vedanta becomes more important for those who have the maturity to be interested in this knowledge and also understand it. And so we have a whole system of teaching that leads us to a teacher that we call a guru. The whole point of a guru is not to teach you how to do yoga or how to do, plumbing. The whole point is to teach you that you are one with the universe. And that wisdom is the most powerful wisdom. And which is why you have this whole culture in India, a whole tradition in India that shows you, that leads you to a teacher who has this wisdom to then impart it to you, because it's one of the hardest things to understand. It is simple because it is you. But because we have grown up in duality, it is the hardest thing because we have to negate what we understand. We have to see differently. We have to understand what we know to be not true. We have to understand what we know in a different way. Just the way we see the sunrise and sunset, and then we have to understand that the sunrise and sunset is nothing but an illusion, and in fact it is an illusion because the earth rotates around the sun. But once we understand that, we don't have to meditate on it, or we don't have to look at the sun and say, well, it is the earth, that is wrong, and I change my lifestyle. Just because the earth rotates around the sun, I don't change my lifestyle. I still go to bed when the sun sets, and I still rise up when the sun rises. But my understanding has shifted. And that is the same way. once you know you're one with everything, you understand things differently. Your relationship changes, your mind changes, your behavior changes, because you see things in that oneness. And that is the greatest gift we can give to ourselves. This body of knowledge is what we call the Vedas. The knowing and the teaching of oneness is what we call Vedanta. Now, in order to know this, there's also supportive texts. We have to have a good mind. We have to have a good body, a healthy body. We have to eat right, because we need the mind to understand. What typically happens is people then put this into mystical form, partly because they don't understand it. They don't make it accessible to people, especially in a first lecture like this. They put a lot of other dramas and they say you have to do many things. Yeah. You have to do this and you have to do that and you have to be worthy of this. So. Yeah. But in a simplistic sense, just to give you a quick summary, that's what it is.
That we all have problems in our life to deal with it and to handle with it, but to handle it in a better way. That's I mean, my goal. Everybody has a different goal. It's just.
So coming back to our lives, we all have problems.
Yes.
There's not a single person who doesn't have a problem, and in fact, you are born to have problems.
Yeah, to cope better with it. That's my. Want to know.
If you didn't come onto Earth, if you did not incarnate as a human being, the very fact that you incarnated as a human being is to deal with problems. But you see, we look at problems in a negative way, and what we do for the most part is we try to avoid problems. We spend a lot of time avoiding problems. Unfortunately, if we really understood what problems are there, they're not there to make your life hell. Problems are not presented to us to punish us.
Yes, I know.
We are not born sinners. We are evolved human beings, and we are born to understand, to know who we are. And the reason we are born to know who we are, and the only way we can know who we are, is through problems. Problems are a gift.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
Problem is a gift for us to grow.
Yeah,
you see,
sorry,
yeah.
That's the point. I don't see to grow on problems. That's
because you're busy trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
You see, the first step, you're asking for steps, I'm giving you the first step.
Okay.
The first step is to change your attitude. And the first step is to look at problems as a gift, as an opportunity. Okay? So that is the first step, because if you can, you see, we say in medicine that 50% of diagnosis is cure. In Western medicine.
That is the point.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're saying, that is the point. That I do not understand why all those problems came up to me are a gift, and yeah.
They are a gift because we learn from them. So, what's your profession, if I may ask?
Oof, I did a lot of things.
But you have a college degree, or?
Yes. Economics.
Yeah. Right.
But I did a lot of philosophy in the beginning of my...
So, but you have taken tests, right? Because you would not get that degree if you did not take a test. How do we know you passed the test? Because you have a degree. If you didn't pass the test, you would not get that degree. If you failed the test, you would not get the degree. So the very fact that you earned that degree or certificate is because you passed the test. So the test is not there to punish you. The test is there to test you whether you know the information or not. You see, when we look at examinations that we take in our lives, we take examinations because we are testing, or there's a system to test whether we actually know what we are talking, because it differentiates someone who has studied. If I studied the information and somebody else who did not study comes and takes the test, and he fails and I pass, it is because I studied. If I say I'm a doctor, and you as a patient want to go and see a doctor, you want to be sure that the doctor knows what he or she is doing. How do we know that he is a good doctor, or that this doctor knows what he or she is doing? It is because he has been certified, or she has been certified that he has passed the test. So passing the test is really important for us to know whether we know something or not. Okay? Challenges in life, problems in life is a test.
What is the degree?
Any degree.
But you're testing yourself, or?
You're testing yourself, because you see, the thing is, it's not that you get a degree in the end that by a religious organization or stuff, but the test is for you to gain wisdom. When you take a test in school, you learn economy. When you deal with life problems, you gain wisdom. That wisdom is the degree. The difference between a person who is sleeping and eating and sleeping every day versus a person who has actually dealt with challenges is very different. Today you're older and you have a lot of experiences under your belt. Today you're wiser than you were 20 years ago, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, in that context, would you say that as we become wiser, that also our problems, because they're not going to go away, but they're simply shifting into a more divine form eventually?
Absolutely.
And where is, where is the end there? What then happens? Could you describe, is there an end? What is there?
So that's a very good question, and I'll explain it this way. So when you go to kindergarten or grades primary, you have primary school in Germany? Primary or?
Yes.
Yeah, primary school. You learn how to add 2 plus 2. When you go to a higher grades, do you still learn 2 plus 2? No. Because 2 plus 2 is something you know in your head. If I say, what's 2 plus 2? You say 4 without thinking. So every time in each grade, but you ask a child what is 2 plus 2, they might have to do finger counts, or they have to do something. So every experience, every challenge we have is presented to us guaranteed. There's no doubt about this. Every challenge that is presented to us is because we can deal with it. Now, if you avoid that problem, you're choosing not to deal with it, which prolongs the pain and it prolongs the problem. Yeah.
But when did I go over? Because the problems you're not dealing or you will avoid, they are coming always again and again. But when it's the point when you dealt with this problem and so it's gone.
When you learned your wisdom. That's exactly how it works. In fact, it even works like magic. When I have a problem, I don't try to avoid the problem. In fact, in the Indian tradition, we have Ganesh.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So Ganesh, his job is to help you remove obstacles.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I do is, whenever I have a problem and I cannot solve it, so there are a few things that I know. One, I've been presented with a problem because God or the universe or fate or whatever knows that I can deal with it. So that's one thing that is guaranteed. If a problem has come to me, there's a guarantee I can solve it. So the first step, which I have provided in the beginning, I said, the first step is to say, there is a problem in my life, let me not avoid it, let me find a way to deal with it. Not that I try to get the problem away, because you see, what happens is when we are presented with a problem, the immediate thing is we want to get the problem out of my life. That's not how it works. That's a wrong approach.
To put it in your life.
No.
No.
What you want to do is you want to shift. You want to learn. For instance, it's dark in this room. What we try to do is we try to remove the darkness. I want the darkness to go away. I spend a lot of energy and I come up with scientific systems and scientific gadgets to remove the darkness. Darkness cannot be removed. The easier way to remove darkness is to bring light. The moment you bring light, the darkness goes away. So what happens is when we're dealing with a problem, first of all, I said there's a guarantee. You, as a human being, dealing with that problem, will have a solution. The problem is presented to you because you are capable of dealing with it. That's one thing that is guaranteed. Second, the problem is presented for wisdom, not for the problem. When we focus on the problem, we're forgetting the wisdom. When we focus on the problem, we're trying to remove the problem and we are not looking at an opportunity to learn. So that's another problem. So the way you shift to this is when a problem is presented, what you do is say, you don't ask for the problem to be gone. What you ask is, what do I have to learn from the situation? And every human being is born alone. Every human being has a different problem. Problems are there for us to grow. That's guaranteed. And once you figure out what the wisdom is that you learn, I can guarantee you this, that the problem disappears like magic. Because I've lived it, I live it that way in my life, I wait. So most of the times, the problems come into our life because we are not dealing with the problem the right way. We make a lot of mistakes and we are approaching the problem the wrong way, so we find that the problem keeps coming back. Another example. As a parent, you might tell your child, don't touch the fire. But as little boys, we don't listen. If the parent told us don't play with the fire, we say, oh, why not? What's wrong? And the mother says to the boy, fire will burn you. The boy says, really? I have never been burnt before. Maybe I want to experience. You touch the fire, you get burnt, and you know mother was right. But if you don't listen, you keep burning your finger. So what happens in our lives is that when we have problems, we approach it the wrong way. We deal with it the wrong way.
Exactly, that's the point.
And so when we figure out, when we change our attitude, when we change our approach, we change our attitude to say, a problem is always an opportunity for wisdom, for me to grow. Number one. Number two, we change our approach, not for the problem to go, but to learn from it. It's a learning opportunity. It's a great learning opportunity, because once you have dealt with that problem, you'll be faced with more problems. Okay, and that comes back to your question. So it's not that the problems don't go away, you get more challenges. But if we get more challenges, why are you presented with more challenges? Because you're evolving.